And recording is in progress. We want to start off by thanking our sponsors this evening. At the gold level, we have NORC at the University of Chicago, SSRS, and IBM. At the silver level, we have GDCC, Bowman Research and Consulting, Edison Research, Global Strategy Group, Queens College, and Ivy Exec. And our bronze level sponsor is Marketing Systems Group. Pennsylvania and New Jersey, at their chapter, we have some of the same sponsors, SSRS, Recon MR, Edison Research and Marketing Systems Group, and also Fairleigh Dickinson University poll. We hope that you'll be able to join us for our next events. Both of them will be in June. The first one is Meet the Masters, which is our flagship educational program. It's going to be split over 2 days and promises to have great speakers. So we're really looking forward to it. And then later in the month, we're going to be meeting in person at an outdoor venue to distribute our annual Harry O'Neill Award for Outstanding Achievement. And I will turn it over to our programming chair, Patrick Coey.
Hello, thank you very much for joining this evening. These are the rules of the road for the audience. All attendees are currently muted. Please do not unmute yourself while presentations are in progress. And if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat bot. We will try to get to them. Although, you know, we do have judges here and we do have a full agenda, but we will try. And maybe at the end of the event, we can open the event to the floor to questions. I'm going to hand it over now to Jay, to our moderator, Jay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to one of my favorite events of the year. I'm Jay Matlin. I'm immediate past president of New York APOR. And as you can see here, we have 9 young scholars whom you'll hear from today. In addition, I wanted to introduce our judges. So next slide. So I want to thank our judges for appearing with us tonight and for judging the papers we're about to hear. Ashley Koenig from Rutgers University, Lee Mehringhoff from the Marist Institute, and Monica McDermott from Fordham. I'm sure they're folks that you're all familiar with, having appeared on various Pan-JPOR, New York APOR programs in the past, and we're very grateful to have you judging the student presentations today. So I think we're at the point now where we can start hearing the presentations. So take it away, Michael.
Okay, Patrick, if you can pull that up. All right. All right, and here we go.
Our first, our first student speaker will be Jen Yu from Yale, who will be talking about candidate background, perceived Asianness, and descriptive representation.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Wu and I am a PhD student in political science at Yale University. I'm excited to present some ongoing research which broadly focuses on unpacking the Asian panethnic label. In particular, the question that motivates my research asks whether the label Asian can mobilize and unite people who fall under that census category. Why is this an interesting question? So here I have a headline from an article written during Kamala Harris's vice presidential campaign, which underscores how her Indian heritage connects her to the Asian American community at large, and is part of the reason why we saw a major increase in Asian turnout during the 2020 election. From prior work on descriptive representation, we have some intuition that this headline would be accurate. There's a general consensus from this literature that if you share a racialized identity with a candidate, you may be more inclined to want to vote for them. However, there is also evidence that this would be potentially different for Asian voters in particular. Here I have data from a survey that I ran asking Asian respondents to rate the quote-unquote Asianness of different groups. We see that East Asians are perceived to be more Asian than South or Southeast Asians. So if there is variation in who counts as Asian, we might suspect that the ability of a pan-ethnic label to unite people, it might not be as effective as prior theories would suggest. I asked 2 questions in this project. First, do individuals view Asian politicians differently based on their national origin identity? Second, I specifically asked whether Asian individuals would support an Asian candidate who doesn't share the same national origin background. To test this, I used a survey experiment which I fielded online in 2021. The vignette that respondents see in the experiment describes a hypothetical mayoral candidate. I primed the politician's background by explicitly describing her national origin identity, and also by using last names that signal that same background. I have 3 treatment conditions, which describe her as being either Indian, Chinese, or Vietnamese. I include a condition in which she is described as being Black, mainly as a way to confirm that respondents are making inferences about the politician on the basis of her being Asian, rather than her being non-white. People might believe that a non-white politician is just more inclined to represent non-white interests relative to a white candidate. I don't specify the candidate's racial background in the control condition, and I just say that her name is Michelle Miller. Basically, it was a little bit weird to describe someone as being the first white person to do something. I did pre-test these names on Turk Prime, and people do seem to believe that a person named Michelle Miller is indeed a white woman. The main outcome that I'll present measures the perception that the candidate can represent Asian American interests. I use linear regression to compare the effectiveness of each treatment relative to control on this outcome. So first, we see that Chinese and Vietnamese politicians are viewed as significantly more representative of Asian American interests than a presumed white candidate. This is also true for an Indian candidate. However, if we compare the estimates from either the Chinese or Vietnamese prime relative to the Indian prime, we see that the differences are significant. This means that while an Indian candidate is perceived to be more representative of Asian Americans than a white candidate, it is to a lesser extent than someone who is Chinese or Vietnamese. We also see a significantly negative estimate on a Black candidate, suggesting that the results for the Asian candidates is actually being driven by the fact that they are Asian, and not just because they're non-white. So one concern in these results is that the positive effects that we see are being driven by a co-national origin preference rather than a pan-Asian one. So for example, is the positive effect on the Chinese prime due to there being more Chinese respondents in the sample, or is it actually shared pan-Asian identity from non-Chinese Asians? I address this by dropping people whose national origin background matches that of the candidate. So in this coefficient plot, the estimate for the Chinese candidate shows that among Asian respondents who are not Chinese, a Chinese candidate is still perceived to be able to represent Asian Americans. This is true for both the Indian candidate as well as the Vietnamese candidate, suggesting that there is some electoral benefit of shared Asian identity. To revisit the questions from earlier, results from the experiment suggest that the answer to both of these questions is yes. Differences in national origin background among Asians seem to spill over onto attitudes towards Asian candidates. However, despite this variation, pan-Asianness still has political relevance. Asian respondents still see Asian candidates as representatives despite different national origin backgrounds. Thank you so much for your time and for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jen. Let's pause here first for a second and see whether or not any of our judges have any questions for Jen. So, Lee, or yeah, go ahead. Lee, you're on mute, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to get a sense of Jen's inspiration for the work, and I'm always curious to know where a student is in their educational pathway.
Yeah, so I'm a current 6th year in the PhD program at Yale. So this project constitutes the second, so the middle component of my dissertation overall, which broadly looks at, as I mentioned, the ability of the pan-ethnic label, Asianness, to unite Asian individuals. This project was in particular inspired by the headlines that headlines like the one I showed in the first slide, where people talked about Kamala Harris as being the Asian American candidate. Part of the experiment that I wasn't able to include in this presentation was actually using a survey experiment similar to the one that was presented, where I talked about Kamala Harris and described her being either Asian or Black or not describing her racial identity. And also comparing that kind of treatment to Tammy Duckworth, who's another decently well-known Asian politician. And part of what drove the design for the experiment that I presented was that I found that Kamala Harris, even though when people are told that she is Asian and they perceive her to be more Asian relative to when they're not informed of her Asianness or reminded of her Asianness, she's not seen as more of a representative for Asians. Whereas if I tell people Tammy Duckworth is an Asian politician, they both see her as actually being more Asian relative to when they don't know that she is Asian or if they're not reminded. And they also do see her as being more representative of Asian Americans. And the interesting difference there is one interesting difference is the national origin backgrounds of these two politicians. So I think that was something I wanted to explore in this survey experiment, which focuses particularly on the national origin backgrounds of different politician types.
Yeah, I just had, I don't know if the other judges wanted to ask anything, so I'll wait a second.
So
I did have
Ashley
one.
or Monica?
Jen, I just wanted, first of all, the research is incredibly fascinating. Truly, truly enjoyed the presentation. Just because of how quickly the presentations go, can you just refresh me? Was this an experiment that you did using a woman candidate only? Was there any kind of treatment of a male candidate that you put into this? Would you expect to see different results? If so, could you just expand a little bit upon that? And I'm sorry if I missed it.
No, absolutely. That's a great question and one that I get quite often. Because, as I mentioned, the genesis of this project was inspired by Kamala Harris. And the original survey experiments in those vein were around Kamala Harris and Tammy Duckworth. When I designed the experiment for the hypothetical candidate, I wanted to make sure that to the best of my ability, I could sort of hold constant certain traits. So one of them was gender. So in the experiment, it is just a woman candidate, and I don't include a condition where I describe the candidate as being male. Partly because I do think, particularly with Asian individuals, gender identity is such a big interactive effect that I wouldn't be able to have enough power given how hard it is to sample Asian respondents anyway from survey samples. So that was definitely a part where I left it in the discussion. This is definitely a pathway for more research, and I wish I could have done that. But at least to address the question, in this experiment, I wasn't able to randomize gender, so it's just a female candidate.
Okay,
So
thank you, Jen.
my question was the same as Ashley's, but I have more questions, but they're about the Duckworth and Harris experiment that you did. So I don't think it's appropriate to go on about that here, but maybe I'll contact you separately about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any casual observations that you might have had of the Wang campaign for president, then New York City mayor, just as someone who's been watching this field and what that might have done or not done? I guess that's some sort of a follow-up to the previous question, so sort of.
I think the very quick answer, because I don't want to push the time too much, my only real reaction was, wow, I wish I could have more money to run more surveys about what it means to actually be an Asian candidate. Because something that Andrew Yang sort of really played up was, I'm an Asian person, I can do math, and all these stereotypes were just evoked in a way that was, offensive to me a little, but also very interesting in terms of how candidates use stereotypes from racialized stereotypes to shore up support that they expect to gain from certain groups.
Good, thank you.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Jen. Now let's turn to Laura Palladino from Stony Brook, who will be talking about hair, hemlines, and husbands, the exploitation of feminine stereotypes in political media. Roll it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Palladino, and I am a current PhD student at Stony Brook University in the Department of Political Science. And today I'm going to be presenting on some original research I've been working on, and the title of this project is Hair, Hemlines, and Husbands, the Exploitation of Feminine Stereotypes in Political Media. So initially, I think it's important to go over a little bit of background information that motivated this project. So there is a ton of research out there that looks at how weaponizing feminine stereotypes can harm women who seek political office. And this is true in a variety of settings. We see that when political candidates attack their female counterparts on the basis of gender stereotypes, it hurts women, but also when the news covers campaigns of women seeking office and describes these women using negative feminine stereotypes, it not only harms their chance of getting elected, but it generally hurts the perception of these women as a whole. However, the literature on political science and gender tends to ascribe the same set of white feminine stereotypes to all women. Most of the time, women in politics are just stereotyped as being weak, incapable, and ineffective leaders. These are traditionally white feminine stereotypes. And there's a ton of literature in psychology, sociology, and race studies, specifically research by Smith, Milham, and Bell, that looks at how Black women frequently get described using a completely separate set of stereotypes. That would be described as being loud, abrasive, or pushy. So when we consider these differences, we can see that two research questions begin to emerge. First, how do feminine stereotype attacks impact perceptions of trust for women candidates? And second, how do feminine stereotypes impact the perception of white and Black women differently? So, to answer these two questions, I ran a survey experiment through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. I conducted this experiment in two separate waves, and the way I set this up was in the form of a vignette study. So all of my participants read a hypothetical newspaper article that a woman was running for office and her male counterpart attacked her on the basis of lacking masculine traits. If we look back to our background information, this is a traditionally white feminine stereotype attack. So my independent variables were not only the presence of the stereotype attack, but also the race of the candidate running. I named my two candidates, Susan Johnson and Althea Johnson, to signal race as both a white woman for Susan and a Black woman for Althea. My dependent variable here was trust. So I measured trust using an IO psychology measure. This comes from Shockley, Zalabach, Ellis, and Winograd, and their measure of organizational trust. So after reading the newspaper article, all of my respondents answered these 5 questions, seeing whether the woman was competent, honest, concerning, reliable, and whether she shares the same values that they do. And so there were 6 different conditions that my participants were randomly assigned to. They could view a white woman, Black woman, or a control with no name. And in these articles, there would either be an attack or no attack. So this would be saying Susan is weak and ineffective for the attack condition, or saying something ambiguous, like there's going to be a tough fight leading up to the primary. And so all of my results came back statistically significant. So this answers both of our research questions. At a glance, we can say that all 5 metrics of trust show significant differences when the attacks were present compared to the control settings where they were not. Additionally, in all 5 measures, there was a significant interaction between race and gender, meaning that Black women were viewed more negatively than white women across the board. The figure on the right illustrates these differences, and though I could only show one of my dependent variables, all of the figures wound up looking about the same. So on the right side, we see that the presence of a gender attack harms perceptions of competence and trust for both white and Black women. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you have any feedback or any questions that I could clarify, feel free to email me at lauren.palladino@stonybrook.edu.
Thank you, Lauren. So let me bring back our judges. Ashley, it looks like you have a question for Lauren.
Yes, how did you know? Lauren, that was another absolutely fantastic presentation. I don't know if you know Leonie Huddy at Stony Brook. I'm assuming you probably do. Just so reminiscent of her seminal work in terms of traits. Did you look at all in terms of partisanship or gender in terms of the effects by gender or bipartisanship. And my little 2-year-old says hi in the background.
Yes, so I did. And surprisingly, there were neither the gender of the respondent or the partisanship made a difference. These were things I controlled for in all of my linear models, and it really didn't make a difference, which I thought to be surprising. In the second wave of this study, one thing that I did find really interesting was that I included a variable measuring racial resentment as well as hostile sexism. And that was the only factor that was a significant predictor of these attitudes. So I controlled for racial resentment and hostile sexism in my second wave of this study and found that those were stronger predictors of these attitudes than either race, gender, or party of the respondent.
I got a question. Lauren, I'm just curious about, did you include pictures at all in your experiment, or you just relied on the names?
In the first wave of this experiment, my first MTurk that was smaller, I did not have pictures. I reran it most recently with a larger MTurk and did include images. So
Okay.
I pulled images from the Rutgers Center for American Women in Politics database. I pre-tested them on an undergraduate sample at Stony Brook and used them in my second experiment.
Fantastic. That was my main question, concern, etc. You got it.
Lee, if you're asking a question, you need to unmute yourself.
What a clever way to talk. Yeah. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hi.
A sense of, just give me a sense of where you see this research going. I mean, I think it was very clear what you presented, but I'm just getting a sense of, where do you think this leads in the our understanding of this issue?
Yeah, so I think the larger message I'm trying to get at with this paper as a whole is that it's really important to be considering intersectional identities in the literature. One of the biggest changes I made in the second round of this study that I couldn't present on in the shorter presentation was also looking at sort of the inverse. How do Black feminine stereotypes impact white women? So I think there's just a lot to be unpacked. In that second wave, I found that it's not so much the race of the stereotype that matters, but it's like the congruency of the application. And by that, I mean like white feminine stereotypes ascribed to Black women is harmful, but also Black feminine stereotypes ascribed to white women is harmful. So I think that's one of the bigger messages I'm getting at, is then that when we neglect these intersectional identities, the results we're really getting at become meaningless because feminine stereotypes are so dependent on race. So that's where I see this going. Of course, if I had more funding, I would love to run more versions of this where I could expand my definition of race, looking at Hispanic or Asian women. I think Nicole Bauer has done some really interesting work on how these stereotypes look different. And then, of course, I would love to do even more research breaking down the gender binary, because then we just get tons of different combinations that could be meaningful.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And now let us move to Sina Sheikh from UPenn, who will be talking about linking of voter turnout and survey cooperation among Hispanic Americans in the 2020 election. Let's go.
Hello, my name is Sina Sheikh. I'm a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania. And today I'll be presenting my research on linking voter turnout and survey cooperation among Hispanic Americans in the 2020 election. So I'll start with my hypothesis. I hypothesized that a delinking of survey cooperation and turnout could explain why our polls in 2020 missed among Hispanic Americans. But what I found is that survey cooperation and turnout are actually more tightly linked among Hispanic Americans than they are among non-Hispanic Americans. So how did I reach this conclusion? I used data from the pre-election telephone component of the National Exit Poll, which sampled just under 1 million Americans from state voter files using registration-based sampling. Now, importantly, I only have turnout info on about 67% of those sampled. And I'll talk about this more in my limitation slide, but I just wanted to flag that here. So of those sampled, About 50,000 were contacted and about 8,500 cooperated. And those individuals were from 10 swing states. I've listed them here. And we have imputed ethnicity for all respondents. So overall, I found that those who cooperated with their survey were more likely to turn out to vote in 2020 than those who didn't cooperate. And this is what we would expect. We expect that there's some underlying level of political engagement which predicts both cooperation and turnout, and that's what we're seeing here. This is good news for pre-election sampling, because the trouble with pre-election sampling is we're trying to measure the electorate, but we don't know exactly who's in that electorate yet. So if people who aren't going to vote are self-selecting out of our sample, that's good news. When we split the data up by Hispanic and non-Hispanic individuals, what we find is that for both Hispanics and non-Hispanics, those who cooperated with our survey are more likely to turn out to vote than those who didn't. But there's a larger gap in terms of turnout between those who cooperated and those who didn't cooperate for Hispanic Americans compared to non-Hispanic Americans. So what does that mean? It means that turnout and survey cooperation are more tightly linked for Hispanic Americans than for non-Hispanic Americans. Now, for the sake of robustness, I repeated this analysis on every state. I also conducted a number of fixed effects models, and these additional models confirmed or supported my initial findings. Importantly, though, you'll notice that in some states, there's a huge degree of error, which brings me into my limitations. So the sampling frame was created using L2 data, which I didn't have access to. So I used target smart data to determine turnout for the people in the sample. Now I was only able to match 67% of those in the sample overall, but that varied by state. So in Alabama and Wisconsin, I was only able to match about 25% of the people in the sample. And in other states, I was able to match over 90%. I'll actually be getting access to the L2 data shortly, and I'll reconduct this analysis when I do. So I found that survey cooperation and turnout are more tightly linked among Hispanic Americans than they are among non-Hispanic Americans. So that doesn't fully answer my initial question about why our polls missed in 2020. In fact, we're able to rule out that this delinking of turnout and cooperation caused the errors that we saw in those polls. But it also indicates a worrying trend, which is that there might be some barriers to both survey cooperation and turnout for some Hispanic Americans. Now, the most obvious is language. It's possible that for Hispanic Americans who don't speak English, their voices aren't being heard in our sample, and they're also not being heard at the ballot box. And that's what I hope to focus some additional research on. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is listed there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sina. I'll turn it back to the judges. Lee, Monica, Ashley, do you have any questions for Sina?
I have a question. I can go first. Hi, Sina. I thought this was really, really interesting. I had two questions for you. And the first one was, how is race being imputed? Is that Target Smart's imputation of race?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So they do it the same way L2 does, basically, pretty much?
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. I assumed so, but I wanted to make sure. And then I was just curious to demonstrate that the gap in Latino cooperation versus non-cooperation, that was wider when it comes to turnout than the white gap was. Did you do an interactive test to determine that, or how did you? Because it looks overall like Latinos just are shifted lower. And yes, the gap looks, if you eyeball it, a little bit bigger, but I wasn't sure if you had actually tried interactive tests on that.
Yes. So it is true that overall Latinos are they're shifted over because they have lower rates of both cooperation and turnout than non-Hispanic individuals. And that's kind of what we would expect. But it's also true that that gap is larger. And I measured that using a number of metrics. So I examined a few different ways. So I checked the correlation between those two. I also did like a difference in means test. And I conducted a number of fixed effects models. And since there was a sort of trend among all these different ways of analyzing that gap, I think that there's some underlying truth that there is a larger gap among Hispanic Americans than there is among non-Hispanic Americans.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sina. Thank you, Monica. Ashley, did you have a question?
Sina, thank you so much for another fantastic presentation. I guess my big question, I know you alluded to this at the end, but what are the practical implications for a pollster like me and for a pollster like Lee when we go into the field for the midterms and for 2024? What are the practical implications of this when at least the media story and some of the data we've seen so far seem to tell the reverse in a way?
Absolutely. That's a great question and something I've given some thought to. So for Hispanic Americans, it means that like the errors that we saw in pollings of Hispanic Americans in 2020 can't be explained with this metric, but that it's important to look to other metrics. Like specifically, I think that the next step in this sort of analysis is to look at survey respondents who respond in Spanish versus survey respondents who respond in English. And I think that this research goes to show exactly how we should be weighting and if we should be weighting like people who respond in Spanish to polls versus those who don't. And I think that if we do weight this correctly, we should be able to actually more accurately predict turnout numbers and how Hispanic Americans will actually be voting in elections.
All right, Lee, your mic is on. So does that mean you have a question?
I'm just, curious. I mean, if I'm looking right at your biography, you're a sophomore, so you seem to be going very quickly through life in this realm, and I'm curious as to, give me a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a sophomore. So I guess that the 2020 election was like the first one that I was in college for. So it's exciting to be involved with all this sort of stuff. And I think that in some ways that limited the amount of research that I was able to do. I wasn't able to conduct my own survey since that I used some existing survey data that's out there. But I think that what being involved in this competition made me realize is that there is so much information available, and there's so many analyses which have yet to be conducted that are just like ripe for the picking. So I'm definitely very excited to do stuff like this in the future, and I'm very honored to be a part of this competition.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sina.
Thank you.
And next up, we have another UPenn student, Francois Barriot, who will be talking to us about Rally Around the Pandemic, explaining gubernatorial approval ratings in the COVID era.
Hello, my name is Francois Barriot. Thank you so much for providing me with the opportunity to share my research on governors' approval ratings during the pandemic. The question at the heart of my research is whether governors' responses to COVID influenced their approval ratings, or if the public's evaluation of state leaders was only dependent on the severity of the pandemic and shifting national political attitudes. The COVID-19 pandemic was a once-in-a-generation event that caused widespread suffering. During the early months of the pandemic, state governors took on the enormously consequential and highly publicized role of responding to the pandemic and protecting the health of the American public. While we might expect the public to blame government, and governors in particular, for the difficulties of the pandemic, there are two ideas that complicate this notion. First is the extensive literature regarding the rally around the flag effect, whereby approval ratings surged for leaders during a time of crisis. As you can see in the graph, approval ratings for governors rallied at the beginning of the pandemic, but steadily declined over time. The second reason why people might not blame governors for the pandemic is that the public may be attentive rather than responsive. Derived from research on retrospective voting, a responsive public is one that reacts only to pleasure and pain, rewarding politicians when times are good and punishing them when times are bad. If COVID cases rise and no level of government response affects gubernatorial approval ratings, then the public can be considered responsive because governors are being punished equally for the pandemic regardless of their actions. In contrast, an attentive public evaluates leaders based off the actions they take and the effectiveness of their policies. If cases rise and government response does indeed affect approval ratings, either by boosting approval ratings or reducing the negative effect that increased cases has on approval ratings, then the public is demonstrating attentive tendencies because approval ratings are being influenced by governors' actions. To study this, I combined three sources: Government Response Index, COVID case severity, and approval of governors' handling of the pandemic. For government response, I use the Oxford Government Response Index, which includes policies such as lockdowns and mask mandates. For measuring the pandemic severity, I use 7-day case averages from the New York Times. And finally, for determining approval ratings, I use over 1 million responses from daily survey tracking data provided by the company Momentive. To determine the relationship between these three variables, I'm going to show how the impact of 1,000 additional cases changes across levels of government responsiveness. These estimates are pulled from a linear regression with fixed effects for counties and weeks. Here are what these relationships might look like under the two theories. If the electorate is responsive, then the public should punish governors equally when cases rise, regardless of the strength of their response to the pandemic. However, if the electorate is attentive, the line should slope upwards, showing that governors with stronger responses are rewarded with higher approval ratings as cases increase. I look at the relationship separately for the first month of the pandemic, where we might see rally effects, and I also look at the relationship in the latter 5 months from the end of April 2020 to September. And indeed, the marginal effects graphs for both periods have a positive slope, indicating that in the rally and post-rally period, stronger government responses are better for governors' approval ratings. Looking at the rally period, we see that as cases increase, there's indeed a level of observed government response that allows for increasing cases to even raise approval ratings. Unlike the rally period, during the post-rally period, there is no level of government response observed in this time frame that allows for increasing cases to raise approval ratings. An example can help illustrate these marginal effects relationships. For a government response index of 60 during the rally period, the model predicts that every 1,000 additional cases in a county will decrease approval ratings by 12%. The main takeaway is that COVID cases are bad news for governors' approval ratings. Only an extremely strong government response when the public was rallying around the flag could allow rising cases to actually increase a governor's approval rating. The electorate must be considered both attentive and responsive. While in many instances, the public blindly punishes governors when the pandemic worsens, governors can reduce this effect by implementing more aggressive mitigation measures. My findings suggest that politicians are moderately incentivized to reduce the severity of the crisis at hand. But as the pandemic has shown repeatedly, there are institutions, political behaviors, and forces of viral evolution outside of any one governor's control. Individual politicians can influence their approval ratings, but they must also face the reality that the public will sometimes lay blame at their feet for events beyond their control. What goes up must come down, and all rallies must one day come to an end. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Francois. So, Ashley, your mic is on. Did you have a question?
Thank you, Mama. Francois, just again, another superb presentation. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but my toddler believes so as well. The natural disaster literature is someone who pulled Chris Christie during Hurricane Sandy and now Murphy during COVID. The natural disaster literature might be a nice complement to the work that you're doing, especially with blind retrospection in terms of punishing governors for things out of their control. But I guess my quick question is, that was more of a comment. My quick question is, so can you explain a little more about your chosen state cases that you drilled down to, why you chose them specifically?
Yeah, so for the overall quantitative analysis, I looked at all 50 states. So I included data on every state over the course of the first 6 months of the pandemic. In the research that I did, this is drawing from my senior thesis, I chose states based off of whether they had high cases and high government response, high cases, low government response, low cases, high government response, low cases, low government response. So I looked at those 4 different factors, and I actually conducted some case studies just looking at what happened in those states. I didn't really talk about that much in the presentation, but I found similar results where governors were able to leverage their stronger responses to the pandemic into creating sort of a appearance of taking action. And actually, you know, the natural disaster literature was something that I definitely looked into. And there's actually a really great article about Chris Christie talking about how he induced this really successful rally around the flag effect that persisted for him, that found something similar where the appearance of taking action really mattered. But I do think that it's interesting that this sort of abstract government response variable does seem to still be having an effect. You know, regardless of how governors are presenting what they're doing, the actual policies they're enacting does in fact matter for their approval ratings.
All right, thank you, Francois. Monica, did you have
Hi.
one?
Yeah, Francois, I think this is really important and interesting stuff you're doing here. So my question was, so I was curious about the state selection as well, but you already addressed that. So it seems to me in the analysis that you're doing here, you get two very conservative states and one where the governor was, to be kind, waffling back and forth, depending on public opinion over what he was doing with COVID. So sorry to Gavin Newsom, but I was wondering if you had looked at all at New York, and if not, what you thought the Cuomo case would do in this case.
Yeah, so in the case studies that I actually did for this research, I did look at New York. I did end up looking at New York, and definitely found that Cuomo had those press briefings at the beginning of the pandemic, and those were very successful, I think, in creating the image of a decisive leader who was strong and who was informing the public and being honest with them. Another interesting thing that I found from the government response index that I used was that New York actually had the highest average government response index at the beginning of the pandemic during that rally period I talked about. So yeah, overall, the policies were much more aggressive during this period than the average state, and actually as opposed to any other state at the beginning. So I think that is interesting. And he did have very high approval ratings at the beginning, though those obviously declined over the course of the pandemic. And then outside of the scope of this research, he obviously encountered several scandals.
Yeah, I think that's an important finding, and you could probably get a paper out of this by itself, the New York case, because it really does sort of justify what he was doing and what the popular conception was of why he was doing so well, because he was taking that commanding sort of stance.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for further qualitative research into what different governors were doing and how they were managing the presentation of their policies. I think that's something really interesting that there could be more work on.
So Lee, I see your camera's off, yeah? And your mic's on?
Yep. I know if you had finished your questions, though. I didn't want to cut in on yours. Had you finished?
Well done.
Okay, good. I just was wondering whether, when I think of the New York case, part of what I think of is how New York was so affected so early on. And so I didn't know if you looked at the different cases in terms of the severity of the COVID relative to the actions of the governors, because I mean, obviously it became much more of a national issue as it quickly progressed. And I just, that was one question just in terms of the extent of the severity in the states of those governors. And I also didn't know whether you took a look at just how fresh and new the governors were, as opposed to Cuomo, who had been around the track, bruised and battered or not. But just in whether those two factors enter into your thinking.
Yeah, so definitely in terms of looking at how policy and cases interact, in the model that I use, the linear regression, I use an interaction term between government response and COVID cases to understand what that interaction is, to really get at that, as well as because I'm looking within weeks in counties, I'm able to some extent look at, as cases change within a county or as government response changes, what are the effects of that on governors' approval ratings, and sort of really drill down into those specific weeks, as opposed to looking at a broader time frame where there's a lot of different things happening. In terms of looking at the experience of the governors, I didn't really get too much into that, to be honest, but I do think that it's interesting that, almost every governor's approval rating went up when the pandemic started, except for actually Ron DeSantis was one of the only governors whose approval rating went down at the very beginning. But it does seem, that would definitely be interesting to see about, how long have governors been in office? How did their previous political, situation affect their rally around the flag effect, and whether that persisted or not? But that wasn't something I got into too much into this research.
All right, thank you, Francois. Thank you, Lee, Monica, and Ashley. Let us now turn to Kevin Covarrubias from Colombia, who will be talking about Sino-Latin American relations, an empirical analysis of the impact of Sino-Latin American economic ties on Latin American national public opinion toward China.
political science MA candidate at Columbia University. Today, I will present my research on the impact of Sino-Latin American economic ties on Latin American national public opinion toward China. To begin, here are graphs visualizing such public opinion from 2001 to 2016 in 17 Latin American countries. I divided the 17 countries into 4 graphs for ease of viewing, the 4th graph being on the next slide. This data was collected from the Latino Barometro surveys with missing years in 2012 and 2014, and data gathering and visualizations are in progress for 2017 to 2021. Now, since the early 2000s, China has established closer ties with Latin America by providing FDI for development projects, increasing trade between the regions, and facilitating meetings between military counterparts 215 times from 2002 to 2019, according to the Inter-American Dialogue. As such, to study this relationship further, I looked at these graphs and wondered what could be causing such cross-national variation in public opinion toward China. Could it be exogenous shocks such as the 2008 financial global crisis, or could it be the global spread of far-right populism from 2016 onward? While these factors may account for some variation, for this study I focus on FDI and trade as possible causal mechanisms. Here is the 4th graph that I mentioned, which is available upon request. My main research question is framed as follows. What is the estimated treatment effect of Chinese FDI and Sino-Latin American trade on Latin American national public opinion toward China? My hypothesis is that Chinese FDI and trade surpluses against China are positively associated with such public opinion, while imports from China exhibit a negative association with this outcome variable. While my full analysis is in progress, I have put together aggregate OLS estimates as well as individual country models for a handful of the 17 countries of interest. Today, I will show the results for Brazil and Argentina. Before showing you the regression tables, allow me to discuss the methodology and data sources. I am adopting an imputed time series linear regression model in STAN-GLM for each of the 17 countries. As for data, I am drawing from the following sources: the Latino Barometro and LaPope surveys from 2001 to 2021, the China Statistical Yearbook for FDI data, UN Comtrade, UNCTAD, and the PRC's Ministry of Commerce for trade data, the Heritage Foundation for data on levels of economic freedom, and the World Bank for data on trade openness. Next, here's the OLS model. The first 2 models for imports and exports fit reasonably well, explaining at least 49% and 44% of the variance respectively regarding favorable views of China across the 17 countries. In column 1, the coefficient is significantly negative, indicating that greater volume of imports from China is linked to a negative impact on China's image perceived in that country, which is consistent with my hypothesis. In column 2, the coefficient of exports to China is significantly negative, which contradicts my initial hypothesis. On the other hand, the latter 2 models for FDI and trade surpluses only account for 0.4% and 0.9% respectively of cross-national variation. In columns 3 and 4, FDI from China and trade surpluses against China appear to not have significant effects on favorable public opinion toward China on an aggregate level, which also contradicts my hypothesis. As such, in future work, I will seek to explain the aforementioned models that reject my hypothesis. Finally, here are the regression tables for Argentina and Brazil. In Brazil, FDI had a positive effect on favorable public opinion, while in Argentina, it had a negative effect. In regard to total trade between these countries and China, the effect was virtually non-existent. That said, the imputed country-level analysis of imports and exports effect on favorable public opinion is forthcoming. Furthermore, as we see in the case of Brazil, my initial hypothesis regarding FDI may be true on an individual country level. So pre-treatment predictors that may account for such variation are population, GDP per capita, economic freedom, and trade openness. Upon completing this work, I suggest that this study can inform future research on the following questions. 1. What is the effect of Chinese soft power on Latin American public opinion toward China on a local and national level? 2. What is the effect of Sino-Latin American economic ties on Latin American public opinion toward China on a local level? And the third question is as follows. Thank you all for this opportunity to present, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Okay, Kevin, thank you. Monica, Ashley, or Lee, do you have any questions for Kevin?
Yeah, I have a question. And Kevin, this is really interesting, although I'm not an expert in economic policy or anything like that by any means. But I was just curious, what makes Latin America so important to you in terms of looking at opinions of China? And do you think this would apply sort of more broadly to developing countries, or is it just something specific about Latin America? Maybe you covered this and I just missed it.
Yeah, good question. I think the motivations that drove this research kind of came from my experiences abroad in China, and also my two recent interactions with a current Latin American president, Bolivian president Luis Arce Catacora, and former Colombian president Juan Manuel Santos. You know, my exchanges with them kind of highlighted the importance of the growing Sino-Latin American economic relation. And, you know, I think doing further research on that relation is very important, especially given its implications for US national security. The last question for further research that I didn't get a chance to read in this presentation kind of looks at whether Latin American elites, you know, what the likelihood of them cooperating with their Chinese counterparts. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, mass public opinion. You know, how does mass public opinion and collective action affect their propensity to cooperate with Chinese elites? And, you know, there is a growing literature on the effect of mass public opinion on foreign policy making. The article that comes to mind is DeVry, Hobart, and Walter, 2021. So I think it's an emerging field, but I think it's also very important.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, Lee or Ashley?
I'm good. Thank you for another wonderful presentation.
Okay,
Very
Ashley?
interesting. And I share with Monica, this is not my you know, back in my youth, this would have been more relevant to my knowledge than. But the question I had is, you identify things that some worked, some surprised, some didn't. Where would you take this going forward?
Great question. So I think well, of course, after finishing the complete regression analysis, one thing I really want to do, pending external funding, is to conduct a original survey of localities across Latin America that are and are not near at least one Confucius Institute, because I think looking at Chinese soft power's impact on the public opinion is also really important. You know, I think an organization that comes to mind is NetQuest. They're a survey research company that, you know, there's actually been precedents for working with them. The two scholars that come to mind are Matthew S. Winters from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and Francisco Ordóñez from Chile. They recently submitted an article for publication on COVID-19 diplomacy in Latin America and the impact on public opinion. So, you know, and the thing is, in the Latino Barometer surveys, and as well as other similar surveys from, you know, the Latin American Public Opinion Project, you know, they asked the question of, you know, to their respondents, you know, what is their opinion on China? But they don't ask about their opinions on the Belt and Road Initiative. They don't ask opinions on the Confucius Institute, and also on their opinions on the impact of local development projects invested by China, the impact on their local economy. So I think this is kind of a gap in the research that needs to be filled.
All right.
And I was just going to say, and also, you know, the relation to the United States, and not that this paper should go there, but it's obviously, you know, in a more global sense, has become very relevant to us in relation to Putin and China and the whole triangular of everything. So this is very interesting.
You brought that up because, you know, as recently as the Winter Olympics, we saw that Argentina, you know, decided to join the China's Belt and Road Initiative as a partner, and you're having more and more Latin American countries express their interest in doing so. Moreover, we see Central American countries one by one cease their recognition of Taiwan as, and also cease their diplomatic relations with them in exchange for relations with China. So I think this is kind of a sign of growing encroachment by the Chinese in America's own backyard.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. So now we will turn to Joel Nee, also from Colombia, who will be talking about Asian American vote choice determinants, applying issue and group-based theories of vote choice to Asian American voters in the 2016 presidential election.
I'm Joel, a Columbia University student researching Asian American political behavior. My research analyzes Asian American vote choice determinants by applying issue and group-based theories of vote choice to Asian American voters in the 2016 presidential election. These seek to assess whether and the extent to which Asian American opinions on political issues and in-group out-group dynamics affect their presidential vote choice. While these theories broadly hold for the electorate at large, little research exists on whether they apply to the Asian American minority, which is regrettable given often unique minority vote choice patterns. Firstly, in terms of an issue-based approach on this slide's left, logit modeling, including demographic controls, finds statistically significant evidence for an issue-based vote choice explanation along dimensions of government economic intervention, immigration, and equality, with higher support for each linked to a higher Clinton vote likelihood. This provides prima facie evidence for Asian American voters employing some degree of rational, issue-based spatial reasoning in vote choice. Notably, opinions on economic intervention policies play a relatively significant role in vote choice, which may be attributable to home country politics and the immigrant experience, especially first-generation Asian Americans. Secondly, in terms of in-group out-group dynamics on this slide's right, logit modeling, including demographic controls, finds statistically significant evidence that negative Asian American stereotyping of other racial groups is linked to a higher Trump vote likelihood. This measure is also heavily correlated with strength of racial identification and provides credence to a sociological-based voting explanation. Crucially, in alternative unshown model specifications, similar dynamics apply to stereotyping of other Asian Americans from different national origins. This reminds us that, despite common oversimplifying coverage, there remains sizable public opinion differences between various Asian American subgroups, i.e., Asian American is not a homogeneous political or social bloc. Turning to this slide's bottom right, linear regression modeling, including demographic controls, suggests an optimistic possible remedy to these hateful in-group, out-group dynamics. Higher contact frequency with other racial groups is linked to lower negative stereotyping. This is in line with Allport's intergroup contact hypothesis that intergroup contact can reduce group-based prejudice under certain circumstances, though further exploration is necessary. Why is understanding Asian American vote choice determinants so uniquely important today? Broadly, any research into Asian American political behavior is vital as a medium to grant this silenced, publicly marginalized group a voice, especially given the recent rise in violent hate crime. Academia has also traditionally paid scarce attention to this group, disproportionately so for the fastest growing American racial demographic that is increasingly politically relevant in swing states. Even where research exists, it is primarily focused on Asian American political participation instead of the political opinions. This is insufficient because understanding their vote choice determinants in terms of their political opinions is something that is uniquely empowering. It lets us understand what they think, i.e. the political opinions, rather than merely what they do, i.e. the political participation, thus giving expression to their hopes, desires, and dreams for their country. Idealistically, to borrow a phrase, the personal is political. It is critical to know about every community's desires in a well-functioning democracy. Practically, this information allows political organization, mobilization, and elite attention based around and on these opinions. My research thus hopes to be a small but meaningful step in this direction for progress for this group. To conclude, I've included my contact details and am happy to discuss other aspects of my research that were left out of this very short presentation. Thank you to everyone and have a very great week ahead.
Okay, Joel, thank you. Monica?
Yeah, Joel, thank you very much for that. I was just curious, this is very straightforward and very interesting. And I agree with you that academically, we don't do enough research on Asian American voters. So this is great work that you're doing. I was wondering if you had tested everything in one model at any point to see whether the issues or the stereotypes sort of came out on top, or whether they just all worked in conjunction or at the same time, et cetera.
Right. So I did run that test and they seem to all work in conjunction. I will say that it wasn't a very strict sort of delineation between whether issues were more significant or the stereotype scale was more significant, because the stereotype scales fell somewhere in the middle between the sort of different issue scales. So that wasn't necessarily very clear. What I think is clear is that both these indicators seem to have a significant impact on Asian American public opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great. Thank you. And I would be interested in this going forward to see if beyond Trump, whether this kind of continues, whether the stereotype effect is there without Trump as sort of the priming force in that.
Okay, thank you. Monica Lee, your mic is on. So.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I find this interesting, and I appreciate that in several of these papers, the point to the diversity within a community and the absence of, a lot of homogeneity that might otherwise be assumed from a distance. And I just want to comment on that. That I found that an interesting aspect of this.
Ashley, did you want to say something? Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this was another fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. I think this is such an interesting juxtaposition with one of the initial presentations. So how would you, just off the top of your head, rectify kind of the descriptive representation that we see in one of the earlier presentations with maybe this non-homogeneity in substantive representation? Maybe how would you kind of reconcile those two things in your mind, or what could you offer us more?
I will say that both offer independent value. It's just that I happen to notice a gap in the literature that a lot of the focus, especially for minority research on minority political opinion, happens to focus a lot more on their participation rather than what they necessarily believe or what they think. So I think to reconcile that, the first thing is obviously more funding, and not just more funding into this sort of research analyzing what they think, but also more funding on specific Asian American groups, especially using things like, for instance, polling in their own language, because that is a massive barrier. And the data set I used by Karthik Ramakrishnan et al., he's one of the main push for this, and it's part of the push to rectify that. So those are the sort of ways I would think that you can reconcile both, but they're not at all in contradiction. I will say that, however, there seems to be a more significant gap when it comes to opinion rather than just pure participation. Yeah.
We can have a debate between Joel and Jen on this.
Jen's presentation was great. I was so happy to see another sort of Asian American voice here as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Joel, you might want, I don't know if you know about this, but the Los Angeles Times poll back in the 90s, so unfortunately it's not very modern data, but they did a huge survey of Los Angeles County, and they looked at different Asian groups and they interviewed them in their own language. And the data set is probably at Roper if you're interested in it. I assume it had some citywide things and some political things, and it might just be interesting for you to take a look at that.
Yeah, thanks very much. I didn't actually know about that. So I'll have a look at that after this. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So let's move on to Michael Yonce now from Stony Brook. We'll be talking about state judicial selection and partisan context.
Hi, my name is Michael Yonce. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Stony Brook University. There is an ongoing debate in both the courts literature and political science and the legal academy about how states should best fill their benches. There are a few systems in use, and of course debates persist about all of them, but the key dispute centers around the appropriateness of partisan elections. Judicial reformers, those who are opposed to the use of partisan election to fill state benches, argue that the public finds partisan elections unseemly because it injects too much politics into the judiciary, creating the opportunity for undue influence, and therefore diminishing perceptions of judicial legitimacy among the public. They argue that legitimacy is largely an apolitical concern that is a long-term, stable belief that the courts are fundamentally morally upright decision makers, as opposed to concerns about short-term policy agreement, ideological congruence, or political approval. They tend to prefer systems of assisted appointment, which they argue increase judicial independence and therefore legitimacy. On the other hand, Typically, political scientists will argue that judges are inherently political, and as a result, the public should have a say in how they are selected. In particular, when asked, the public will explicitly report a preference for election over systems of appointment. This leaves us with two questions. Why do people say that they prefer election, but in elected systems find courts less legitimate? And why is this legitimacy finding inconsistent? Why do we sometimes find null effects? I argue that the effect is contextual and rooted in partisanship. Partisans tend to view their own beliefs as more rational and less ideologically influenced than the beliefs of their opponents, so perhaps people feel the same way about in-party judges. And if that's the case, maybe legitimacy is rooted more in my partisan context than anything to do with a particular selection method. If I'm in the majority in my state, why not support partisan election? I can hold the judiciary accountable, participate in the process, and still elect judges who I believe to be not biased. On the other hand, if I'm in the partisan minority, now I have the worst of both worlds. I have to participate in all the ills of partisan election and see judges who I believe to be biased selected to the bench. As a pretest for this idea, I turned to Amazon's Mechanical Turk. I asked participants to rate their state on a scale of 0, totally controlled by Democrats, to 100, totally controlled by Republicans, and then code this so that relative to each participant, the scale ends up being 0, total out-party control, to 100, total in-party control. The lowest one-third of that scale I consider partisan minorities, and I measure our judicial legitimacy items that have been used in the literature before, measuring these 4 constructs. My hypothesis here is that people in the partisan minority will display lower levels of judicial legitimacy, particularly in partisan systems. Breaking down responses to the legitimacy scale by selection method and political minority status, an interesting effect emerges, which is partisan minorities in partisan election systems perceive their courts to be less legitimate than those who are not minorities, and this effect approaches statistical significance at 0.08. Following up on this pretest, I run an experiment on a nationally representative sample in which I present participants with a description of a state court system, varying the typical partisanship of the state's voters, and the method used to select its judges. Displayed here is the partisan election condition. The results from this experiment support my hypothesis that partisanship matters for evaluations of judicial legitimacy. Across types of selection methods, being told that the state is comprised primarily of out-party voters significantly diminishes perceptions of judicial legitimacy. Note here, nothing is said about the courts themselves being partisan, just the state's political context and composition. On the other hand, selection method never produces a significant effect. People don't perceive one method of selection as more or less legitimate than the other. They base their decision entirely on party control. In short, partisanship matters. Courts are evaluated based on my individual partisanship and the partisan context in which I find myself. Significant out-party control of the judiciary diminishes perceptions of judicial legitimacy. Legitimacy is not an apolitical variable rooted in rule of law principles. It is instead evaluated in partisan context. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. All right, let's bring the judges back. Monica or Ashley or Lee, do you have any questions for Michael?
I don't have any questions. I just am blown away by the bearing of this, just what this brings to light in terms of our judicial system and the Supreme Court and everything else. I mean, there's so far you could go with this that I really think it's fascinating, and the experiment especially. So thank you. Well done.
Thank you, Monica. Anything from either of you, Lee or Ashley?
I just agree with Monica, and you know, I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure surely has implications for other types of elections. In fact, Michael, have you explored anything like that or touched upon it in any lit reviews? You know, the relationship that it may have, what you're seeing, how that would be in the context of different types of elections, different types of positions.
So I haven't looked at other types of elections, but I do have another paper that's looking specifically at partisan minorities, right? I started part of this project motivated by this idea of what does it mean if I'm a Republican in New York or a Democrat in Alabama? How do I, go about living my life knowing that I'm in a system that I am just deeply opposed to? So I haven't looked at electoral forces in other papers, but I have looked at sort of social forces, how people interact with each other, perceive their neighbors and their government, things like that. And some of the results are shocking might be overselling it a little bit, but people who are partisan minorities are kind of afraid and stressed out. They're worried about being ostracized at work, ostracized from their friends and family, that their political views might impact their careers. So your political context matters a lot. And if you're sort of on the outside looking in, people are sensitive to that and get pretty nervous. So I am certain it has some effect on elections, just not one I've gotten into yet.
Yeah,
I see a question coming from you.
Yeah, I was just going to comment also that, I mean, if my memory serves me right, Scalia was voted in, I believe it was 98-0 by the Senate. And to Monica's point, hello, we just the world is a very different place since then. And it ain't so long ago, but yeah. So no, I appreciate the paper and I appreciate the topic and its relevance. I don't think we've heard the last of this kind of stuff. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. All right, let's now turn to Paul Lendway of Yale, who will be talking about group reclassification theory, how populist appeals undermine support for democracy.
Hi, my name is Paul Lendway, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in political science at Yale University. And today I'm presenting group reclassification theory, how populist appeals undermine support for democracy. Let me start with a quote by a popular populist, Trump. Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. Populism is typically conceptualized as a thin-centered ideology consisting of anti-elitism, an emphasis of the good people, and the centrality of their will. A populist appeal, then, is a sort of rhetorical vessel through which these three constitutive parts of populism are conveyed to the mass public. The puzzle of populist appeals, then, are what are the mechanisms through which populist appeals operate, and what outcomes do populist appeals affect? I propose group reclassification theory, in which I argue that populist appeals operate as a joint process of in-group legitimization and out-group delegitimization that recast public beliefs and preferences. I then investigate, do populist appeals induce support for violations of democratic principles, to which I find that they do. With populism growing throughout the globe, many scholars are worried that populists will use the mantle of democracy for authoritarian ends, pointing to cases like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Survey experimental research has found that populist appeals can weaken trust and confidence in elections. The primary mechanism through which populist appeals are typically investigated is the blame attribution mechanism, that is, the anti-elitism component, which has been shown to increase populist attitudes, support for populists, and to reconfigure policy preferences, such as redistributive preferences. But important gaps remain in our understanding of populist appeals. First, because scholars typically don't disaggregate the populist appeal, it is unclear how the good people and people's will components of populism operate. Furthermore, there's a lack of experimentation testing whether populist appeals increase support for violations of democratic principles. I present group reclassification theory that argues that populist appeals operate as a joint process of in-group legitimization and out-group delegitimization that recasts social norms and beliefs, such that what was previously considered illegitimate becomes legitimized, and vice versa. You broke the rules, elites, so we the people can too. Here's a graphical depiction of my theoretical framework that maps cleanly to my three core hypotheses. First, that populist appeals increase in-group legitimization. Second, that populist appeals increase out-group delegitimization. And third, that populist appeals increase support for violations of democratic principles. To test these three core hypotheses, I conducted 3 separate national survey experiments. In every survey experiment, subjects were shown a political speech by a candidate. In the first study, the main issue was coronavirus. In the second, it was student debt. And the third, it was the filibuster. The control group was just shown the political candidate talking about that issue. But the first treatment group was shown that issue plus a populist appeal by the candidate in which a particular group of elites was blamed for that issue. In the coronavirus study, it was Congress. In the student debt study, it was university leaders. In the filibuster study, it was the Senate. Notice that in studies 2 and 3, There was also a treatment condition in which the issue was discussed, plus an emphasis of the good people and their will, in addition to another treatment group in which the issue was discussed, plus anti-elitism. At the end, subjects were asked basic outcome questions regarding in-group legitimization, that is, perceived legitimacy of the candidate, out-group delegitimization about the targeted elite group, and support for violations of democratic principles, like violations of separation of powers. And indeed, by pooling results from all three studies, I found that the populist appeal increases in-group legitimization, increases out-group delegitimization, and increases support for violations of democratic principles. This provides strong evidence for group reclassification theory while showing that populist appeals can, in fact, increase support for violations of democratic principles. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul. Any questions from our judges? Monica?
I guess I'll go first again. I just wanted you to expand on the idea of coronavirus. I guess my curiosity was when you actually conducted surveys, because COVID became so much of a populist issue so early on, and the anti-elitism that was surrounding it in terms of, academics and scientists and doctors and things like that was so much a part of it that I'm wondering if you separated that out from student debt and the filibuster, does that change the results? Is it different on its own? Have you looked at it independently? I'm just curious about how that worked out.
That's a great question. Yeah, in terms of timing, I actually conducted it around March of 2020. So still fairly early, although to your excellent point, I mean, clearly there was a level of anti-elitism kind of embedded into the sort of national discourse of COVID. And that really motivates doing those additional studies, the student debt one and the filibuster. I actually just ran a fourth one on inflation. And so I've tried to basically, do issues as it become maybe slightly more salient. Of course, I think these, it's hard to compare these issues directly. Some are economic, some are about government procedures, some are, more public health. And in some cases, of course, it's hard to disentangle those things. And that's kind of the point, is that I'm trying to see how can we generalize how populist appeals operate across a variety of issues with varying levels of salience and policy complexities.
That's great. Thank you. I think it's great work and you have a good future with it.
Yeah, for a good future, for good or ill. I'm not sure which way we're going, which is what my question, you lead right into it. I think a lot of us are concerned about, where this varying populism is going in different places of the world, and not distinct from our own country. And as you were talking, it just came, Hillary Clinton using the word deplorable and how Trump took that and ran with it. I mean, just as like, could there have been a worse word to use to that? But give me a sense of, guide me a little bit in how this research or your understanding of this topic can help me better understand, the appeal of Donald Trump and Barack Obama with people who kind of felt out of the system. Obviously, their appeals were very different, but they seem to get the votes of a lot of people that would be classified this way. So I'm just wondering if you could guide me there anyway.
Absolutely, Lee. And I think that's the key point, is that we see populism on the right and the left. Of course, people, will commonly point to, Trump as a far-right populist, and that's true. But we also see it on the left with Bernie Sanders. And indeed, Obama, as you mentioned, made some very left populist comments. Now, left populism is typically thought of as kind of on the economic dimension. You recall he regularly would kind of bash Wall Street. And so it's kind of creates challenges for, when we think about, should we really be saying that such and such candidate is a populist and another isn't, or is it more kind of on a continuum of how populist they are? But I think you have kind of an excellent point, especially what you said about candidate favorability. And one thing that I'm finding, because as I go through these experiments, is in trying to kind of disentangle the difference between a candidate who is anti-elite versus populist. As I said, the populist part has that emphasis of the good people and their will. what I'm finding is the populist part does a lot more to increase candidate favorability than just the anti-elitism component, which is really interesting. And when we think about the demand side of kind of the public demand for these populists and what sort of makes them so attractive, and I see sort of the key contribution from this paper, building on prior research, as not just looking at that anti-elite component, but what else is it? Are the good people and people's will components doing to act in concert to transform mass public opinion?
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And now our final paper of the evening from Sabrina Arias of Penn. Think globally, act locally, the determinants of local policymaker support for climate policy.
Good evening. My name is Sabrina Arias. I am a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. And today I am presenting co-authored work with Joshua Schwartz, who is another PhD candidate here. So our project is called Think Globally, Act Locally, the determinant of local policymaker support for climate policy. So we know that in recent years, there has been limited federal level progress on the issue of climate change. We've seen quite drastic changes in climate policy between administrations, and proposed legislative solutions like the Build Back Better agreement have collapsed in legislative efforts at the national level. However, we have seen substantial progress at the local level, and we observe that many local officials are picking up the slack in the U.S. commitment to making progress on climate change initiatives. We see many ambitious plans for local policymakers, such as the ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability Initiative. And so what this is showing us is that climate progress has become a bottom-up phenomenon in the US. However, most of our research on climate preferences has not taken into account these dynamics. So this leads us to our research questions in this project. First, we ask what factors impact whether local policymakers decide to support climate plans. Or in other words, what are local policymakers' preferences over different climate agreements? This is a critical sample to understand preferences over, because policymakers are the critical decision makers at the local policymaking level. And so we expect that the design of climate plans matters in predicting local policymakers' support for different agreements. Our second research question is whether the preferences of policymakers and the public are in alignment or in discord.
Michael, do we have a
congruence between preferences of local policymakers and the public over climate plans? So to test these research questions, we deployed two survey experiments, one on an elite sample of local policymakers and a replication on a representative sample of the US public. We employ a conjoint experiment, which is a survey experimental design that allows us to test multiple attributes of plans at once, and testing complex decision-making processes that more closely mirrors the actual processes that local policymakers engage in on a day-to-day basis. And we look at 7 specific attributes of climate plans based on their substantive importance, as well as their previous prevalence in the literature. So we look at specific policies, politically relevant endorsements and participants, as well as structural characteristics. Just a quick overview of the results that we find. They are hearteningly optimistic for the progress of climate policymaking at the local level. We find that design does matter, and that preferences respond to the different designs of the plan. We also find that there's a high degree of agreement between policymakers and the public, as well as between Democrats and Republicans on the design of plans. So this suggests that if climate plans are well designed, taking into account the preferences of key constituencies, there is prospects for progress. So these are the attributes and levels that we include in our research design. I won't discuss them here, but I would be happy to go over any of them in more detail. And this is an example of the type of task that respondents received. They engaged in 4 of these tasks. So we find, again, that preferences do respond to the design of the plan, and that the distribution of preferences between local policymakers and the public is highly aligned. This is an example of our results for one of the attributes. Again, because of time constraints, I won't discuss this in detail, but happy to spend more time on this. We find that the structure and design of the plans matters as much as partisan endorsement. So our overall takeaways are that design of these climate plans does matter. Partisan politics is important, but not to the same extent it is at the national level. And so synthesizing all of these things, because there is high agreement among relevant constituencies and preferences move in response to plan design, we conclude that climate progress is possible at the local level if such policies are well designed. Thank you so much for your attention.
And thank you, Sabrina. So, Lee, you would like to go first.
I just want to say that ninth does not necessarily mean last. But the question I have to ask is the dog at the end. I mean, I'm going right to the important part of the research. Yours?
So that is the stock image. If you search for like environment or climate change dog or something like that, he comes up.
Yeah. So guide me, as I've asked other people tonight, guide me where you think this is going in terms of the interesting part of the switch to the local and that policy perspective. What should I look for in this field as it develops? Because obviously the climate it's only just begun.
I think that's a really interesting question. Theoretically, if we see alignment and preferences of policymakers and their constituencies, this begs the question of then why haven't policymakers taken action so far, right? What's blocking them? And so we think that the next direction that researchers need to go in understanding this is to examine second order beliefs. That is, what do policymakers believe their constituencies prefer? And so what we find suggests that policymakers believe their constituents are much less favorable to these plans than in fact they actually are. So what we hope to do next is to actually convene a focus group of local policymakers from Western Pennsylvania and here in Philadelphia and try to understand whether updating second order beliefs about constituency preferences in fact encourages more action at the local level. I think there's a lot of folks doing really interesting work on the local politics of climate policy. For example, Leah Stokes is doing really great work in this area. And I think that given the collapse that we've seen at the federal level and the stickiness of public opinion, at the kind of national level, this local direction really seems to be a lot more promising.
Thanks, Sabrina. Monica or Ashley?
Yeah, this is obviously a very large project. There's so much going on that you didn't get to show, and it's far too much for a 5-minute presentation, I'm sure. So I'll just look forward to the paper being published, which I'm sure will be someday. But I did, since we're a public opinion crowd, I wanted to ask you about your survey of the local officials and how to get a little bit more detail on how you did that, because those aren't easy things to do. So that's a heavy lift.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we collaborated with an organization called Civic Pulse, which maintains a panel of local policymakers and representative communities across the country, ranging from very small municipalities to large cities. And so they're able to field these surveys in waves. Because this is a really special sample, we have to apply for space similarly to like a test kind of situation. It is expensive sample, so we've been really fortunate. We've applied for several grants for this project, and that's really helped us to move forward with it. But I really encourage anyone who's interested in understanding attitudes of local policymakers to pursue the opportunities in Civic Pulse, because I think it's a really great resource. One thing that does restrict us in our analysis is the anonymity of these respondents is something we're really careful about protecting, and we really want to make sure that we're not poisoning the well to any extent with this sample. So there are certain things we would love to do, really drilling down to the local level, seeing whether at different regions or different parts of the country there's heterogeneity in these preferences. And we can get at this to a certain extent. In our demographic battery, we ask policymakers whether their communities have experienced the effects of climate change, whether they have green or extractive industries in their communities. But we can't do things like say, oh, policymakers in coastal communities, right, have these different types of preferences, or in southern states have these different types of preferences. So that's one constraint of working with this panel.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sabrina. Ashley, do you have any final questions?
No, thank you for another great presentation.
Okay, great. So we're just past 7:30 now, but we now need to allow the judges to deliberate. And so hope that all of you who are still with us will stay on for just a bit and wait to hear the judge's decision. So the three of you will loop into another breakout room, right?
Yeah, just give me a second and I will set that right up.
All right.
Okay, so, oh, well, sorry, that's not for everybody. That should be just for our judges to join their room.
I didn't see any invitations.
All right, cool.
Okay.
So that should be good.
That's right. Okay. Well, since now, I think, this might be a good opportunity if anybody who's attending has any questions for any of our speakers. Since we didn't have a chance to take questions during the event itself, other than from the judges. Well, actually, I was curious. So I heard.
Yeah, I do, Jay.
Go ahead, Patrick. Take it away.
I have a question for Paul. Populism and democracy. The delegitimizing attacks that populists levy against their opponents. They're delegitimizing attacks, like one side calling the other's supporters deplorables, and the other side calling the other side's supporters something else. How do you fight that? Like in a practical level, speaking from a campaign, war room, how do you respond to attacks like that? I know the tendency is probably fight fire with fire. Is that the advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. By the way, it says that the host disabled my video, so I can't turn that on. But that's a great question. I think I think it's important to look at the psychology literature, because there is oh, I'm able to start now.
There you go.
There we go. Yeah, the psychology literature, of course, has actually a little bit ahead of the populism literature on this, because we've seen historic delegitimization of groups, of course, throughout history, right? Slavery in the United States, World War II, treatment of Jews, and so on. And so there's a whole kind of literature about what happens when there's this sort of, delegitimization of groups and efforts to sort of counteract that. In one of my publications, looking at redistributive preferences, I assess how providing subjects with sort of emotional vignettes about recipients of programs like Medicaid and Medicare affects their policy preferences. And so potentially enhancing empathy can be thought of as kind of one way to counteract delegitimization attempts. But I think it's a great question. It's very difficult, when, especially if it's kind of coming down from the elites, this sort of delegitimization. It's very difficult to then counteract it.
Thank you. I also have a question for Lauren. Hemlines and husbands. Here on Long Island, there are 3 open seats for Congress at the same time, virtually unheard of. And the 4th seat on Long Island is a first-term congressman, a one-term congressman. There must be a multitude of females running for public office at the congressional level. Are you at all interested in taking your your research and putting it into practice on a campaign for Congress. Is that
Are you asking her if she's running for Congress?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by like, applying it. But I mean, this is definitely something we'll have to be looking out for. And I mean, I go to school in Long Island, so I'll definitely be paying attention to that coming up.
Yeah, that's one of the seats. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, working on this research project has made me a more like critical consumer of campaign media and news coverage, generally speaking. I don't know a lot yet about the candidates that are running for these open seats, but if there are women, there will be bias, there will be stereotypes thrown out there. Especially I'm imagining in a Republican dominated area like Suffolk County. So I don't know what else to say besides it'll be interesting.
I can see your advice being helpful in responding to this situation as it presents itself to female candidates. How does a woman respond to the stereotypes? And I see that's the practicality from a practical campaign point of view to your research. Practical advice in political campaigns.
Yeah, I guess the inference that I can draw from my experiments that I've run would be to, revert to the control condition that didn't introduce bias. So redirecting the conversation away from a feminine stereotype and into policy. In my control conditions where stereotypes weren't present, I crafted conditions that focused on the woman's policy or just kind of focusing coverage on the race as a whole. So I feel like, to correct for stereotype attacks, it's really just a matter of sticking to the policy platform, focusing on, the election broadly speaking. Like, is it a competitive election? What am I bringing to the table? What is my policy platform? Because at least from my experiment, that was the condition that didn't generate as strong of a bias against women.
Okay, good, interesting.
Does anybody else have any other questions for our speakers today? I guess my question was, and I can't remember which, I think there was more than one of you that referred to it, and I apologize that I can't remember which of you it was, but there are at least one or two of you mentioned MTurk, and I guess maybe I'm sort of old school, but I don't know what MTurk is. Because since somebody explain what this seems to be a sample source that's readily available that I don't know anything about, and I guess it'd be great if somebody could enlighten us. Is that you, Jen? Yeah.
So I didn't actually use MTurk in my experiment, and in this experiment that I presented, but Prolific is a quite similar platform where you have registered users who have accounts and they get, I forget what the platform looks like currently because I think it's been updated quite a bit, but my understanding is that you have sort of like an interface where you can select which surveys you want to take, and it advertises an hourly or minutely rate that survey researchers will pay. I think it originated out of not survey research intentions, but more like someone needed a transcription of something and they just wanted to advertise a job. So I feel like the survey platforms that we now more commonly see, like Lucid Marketplace, I use Prolific quite a bit. They're more like people want to take surveys, so they just have these accounts, and then there are these surveys that all these academic researchers field on the accounts, which is, I think, slightly different than how nationally representative samples are sometimes recruited, where you kind of just get like phone calls or like emails or mailers sometimes in attempts to construct a nationally representative sample. So I feel like with Turk, it's a lot more opt-in than some other platforms that some researchers may use.
Okay. And the rates are sufficiently reasonable that it's possible for students to afford them then?
I guess it depends on the person. So I try to pay relatively reasonable rates, like an hourly rate that is not terrible. But I think that's because from its inception, I think people used to pay like pretty paltry amounts because it was like cheap labor in a way that was, I don't know. I try not to do that if I can, but I'm sure others have their own experiences.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Monica, looks like you guys are back.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for staying with us. It should go without saying, it was an incredibly difficult decision deliberating. Every single one of these presentations was fantastic. I think about 6 years out from my PhD now, and it just brings me back and just gives me such hope for the current cohorts. We thoroughly enjoyed every single one of them, and all of you have such bright futures ahead of you. And always please contact us if you have any, desire to talk about survey research and public opinion. But without further ado, I guess I will start with our runner-up. I'd like to say, actually, our runners up, we decided to split the runner-up position because, again, these were so outstanding. Proverbial drum roll, we're going to be splitting the runner-up between Jen Wu and Sabrina Arias. And our first place is going to go, again, little proverbial drum roll, to Lauren Palladino. So Lauren Palladino is our first place winner. Jen Wu and Sabrina Arias are our second place winners. Thank you all so much for absolutely fantastic presentations. We are so proud of each and every one of you.
It was really hard to make this decision. We're not just saying that to be kind. It was really, really hard.
No, it did, and I think that all the students, who listened to each other could imagine that this was not a slam dunk for us by any means. But we enjoyed, all your presentations, and I hope the folks who were watching also, got benefited from it as well. So it was hopefully a good evening for public opinion.
Well, from my perspective, this was a very encouraging and enlightening evening. Makes us all feel very good about our field and the future of our field. So Amber, is there anything more that you wanted to say in closing? Assuming you're still on. But anyway, I echo Lee's and Ashley's and Monica's congratulations and thanks to all of our young public opinion scholars today. I think, I don't know if you mentioned this, Michael, but actually there were more applications than we were able to fit into the program. So the 9 of you who presented today were, hadn't went through a selection process before you appeared on our stage. And we were all, I certainly was, I'm sure many of us were quite impressed with the level of professionalism and rigor that you applied to the research that you presented and the way in which you presented it. So thank you all very much. Patrick, was there anything more you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say thank you to our event organizers, Ashley and Michael. Thank you very, very much. It's been a few months' work on this, and it paid off. Looks a tremendous event. And give kudos to our video production person, Kathleen Weldon. And of course, to our judges and to all young public opinion scholars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Kathy, for weaving all of the presentations together into one seamless video. Okay, that wraps it up for us today. Hope to see you at the next event.
Good night.
Good night.